I'm Damien Godderis. I'm Industry Engagement Manager focusing on international payments. International payments have already evolved significantly in the recent year, from a complete black box to transactions that are now traceable and transparent in terms of fees and ethics, and they are still evolving in order to reach the next level, which is the international instant and frictionless payments. And of course, it's following the trend that we see on local markets that are already instant or are in the process of being instant. These local markets have defined the expectation of our clients to get the same experience on their international payments. And in that journey, one of the key milestones coming soon is the ISO migration. The ISO migration will be a key element to the success of these international instant and frictionless payments. The recent change in international payment have brought the transparency and the traceability on payments, but key elements are still missing for our clients. The predictability on fees, know upfront how much fees will be taken and the amount that will arrive to the beneficiary, as well as the certainty of the payment execution. They want to know that it will be executed and by when it will arrive to the beneficiary client. At the same time, we have seen a lot of improvement in the international payments, and the traceability is a key element that corporates are reporting to us as a great improvement. And now, since November 20, with the universal confirms, they are receiving the confirmation of credits for their transaction. So it allows them to know that the payment has been executed, that the beneficiary gets the funds, and in case they are receiving questions for their client, they are able to prove that they have executed the payment and that it has been credited to the beneficiary customer. At the same time, they are still facing some challenges, specifically in new currency or currency that have a lot of constraints in terms of data that they need to provide. To help them, we have built a currency guide a few years ago that told them all the information they need to provide to their payments, but it's still only the requirement of BNP Paribas and our correspondent. There are still other actors in the chain, and these actors can ask additional information. And that's the reason why we are now looking at solutions, not as only BNP, but the community, to do pre-validation of these transactions. So really validate by all the actors involved in the transaction, the payments, to make sure that at the moment it's executed, it goes without any friction. Since the launch of GPI, BNP is providing a lot of new services to their clients. The ability to track the payment in BNP e-banking, as well as the ability to provide this status to the corporate. So they can directly integrate these statuses into their system. We have also added the capability to track incoming payments, so the corporate can see all the payments that are coming to their account before they reach BNP. And that allows them to anticipate any delay in these payments and manage better their liquidity. At the same time, we have also offered services for the client of our corporate, and we call it the Bene Tracker. When the corporate executes their payments, they can also share to their beneficiary a URL and a unique identifier that will allow the beneficiary to track the payment even if they are not a BNP client. So that allows the beneficiary to themselves see the transaction and avoid raising questions to their banks or to our client to understand where the transaction is. Market is being disrupted by new actors, and these new actors are focusing on specific pain points. So they identify an area where they can improve this experience. This should be seen by the banks as an opportunity to innovate, and reduce the time to market. And a good example with that is SwiftGo. It's a new initiative that has been launched to focus on the low-value payments and make sure that these low-value payments arrive with full amounts to the beneficiary customer. And it's a community initiative, so it's really shown that the banks can react to this disruption. At the same time, for me, another way to respond to these disruptors is to partner with them. And a good example with that is the partnership BNP has done with SysID that allow our corporate to validate the beneficiary detail upfront of the execution of the transaction, and of course, then reduce the risk of fraudulent payments. We see international payment being impacted by the global trade in the emerging market because they are building solutions to automate this trade process, and it's very important that these processes are efficient, and they are building even ecosystem to process all this trade. And the result of that is they want to automate end-to-end this process. And of course, the last leg of this process is the payment settlement. So it is important that banks are capable to receive these payment requests, process it in the most efficient way, including these new emerging currency for which additional requirement can be required. And a good example for that can be to really connect to this trade ecosystem and offer solutions like request to pay, where really all the data will be pre-filled to make sure that the payment can be executed easily, or at least being sure to provide all the elements that will allow easy reconciliation of these transactions. The consequence of the pandemic has been the acceleration of the digitalization of the supply chain process, the order to cash and procure to pay services, as well as an increase of the e-commerce on a large scale. These elements have increased the number of international payments, but by increasing the number of international payments, you also increase the risk of fraudulent payments. So it's important for the banks to make sure that when we are growing in international payment, we also have all the services in place to protect our client. Like mentioned earlier in the discussion, that's the reason why we see that it's so important to validate the beneficiary information to make sure that the payment, when executed, will arrive to the correct account owner. Regulation is a very challenging topic on the international payment scale because international payments involve different countries, different currency, and that means a lot of different requirements. But at the same time, we see that countries and markets are looking for more rich and structured data in order to be better in anti-money laundering, to compliance. So we need to provide this additional information. And the ISO migration that is starting next year is a response to that. The ISO will allow banks and clients to pass more rich data and also structured data that will facilitate the automation. In the first release of the ISO migration, so the first step, November 22, the focus is really in the interbank space. So it's really between banks, making sure that the banks are capable to send and receive ISO messages. And for that, Swift will launch Transaction Manager. So Transaction Manager will help the ISO migration in its first release, making sure that the rich and structured data are delivered end-to-end, even if some actors in the chain, that could be banks, but also market infrastructure, are not yet fully ISO compliant. But of course, corporate will take an important role in this ISO migration. They will help us to build our roadmap, because this November 22 is only the foundation of this migration. So we will need to work with the corporate to make sure that they are able to provide this rich information that is reaching the end customer. They will help us to work on the pre-validation to make sure that we are able to pre-validate the account, the beneficiary name, but also all the elements that are required to execute the payment. And we would like to go further. It's also making sure that all the actors involved in the transaction are identified at the moment of execution, are able to validate that they have all the elements required to process the transaction, and also that they are able to provide the fees that will be taken to the transaction, which means when the corporate execute the transaction, they know upfront all the fees that will be taken to their transaction and can make sure that the correct amount arrives to the beneficiary account.